So I'd like to call up our next panel session called Bringing the Energy. And they'll be asking questions like, what is Greater Western Sydney's competitive advantage when it comes to leading the transition to net zero? And how can Greater Western Sydney lead the clean and green transition? So for this conversation, I'd like to invite up our panel members, Dr. Roger Attwater from Western Sydney University, Terri Butler from Circular Australia, Guy Chalkley from Endeavour Energy, Chris Gould from Sydney Water, as well as our session provocateur, Struan Buchanan from Deloitte.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was a great presentation. I'm really pleased to be accompanied by 4 people and from organisations that have a big role to play in the transition and in helping Greater Western Sydney achieve a clean and green future. Today we are going to be talking about how Greater Western Sydney can lead that, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And competitive advantage as well is an area of interest to talk through. Why do you have me up here? Just a quick comment. So I work with organisations on strategies and to help transform in the context of energy transition. I spend a lot of time working with businesses in Western Sydney as well. So first, a few opening comments. So, we're all quite aware of the scale and speed of spend that is required and that's happening to achieve our net zero emissions future and sustainability outcomes, both in Greater Western Sydney and nationally. The list includes new clean generation capacity technology, massive transmission investments, interconnectors and new connections for significant commercial loads, distribution spend, and the list goes on. To make it more tricky, it requires systems thinking, from global considerations like supply chains and material flows, to regional and locally specific dynamics like community, Indigenous leaders, jobs, biodiversity and others. On investment required, it's massive, it's significant. We need to attract investment from world-leading organisations and world-leading low emissions and transition technologies as well. A critical factor in that is how we manage that in light of affordability and critically to enable growing businesses and communities in Western Sydney to grow. On speed, it's going to require alignment across a number of different organisations, and we heard about the number of government agencies last night that are involved. The number of organisations is massive. There's huge foreign investment interest and so on. So alignment across all of these players in the region and with interest in the region is really critical. The WPCA, for example, has been setting a vision for Bradfield City Centre to be net zero emissions from day one. Achieving that requires bringing all the right organisations together in the right way and at the right time. Do we have the right market environment to be able to do that? Is that possible today, or are additional changes required? It'd be good to talk through that. And I'm really interested in the idea of Greater Western Sydney leading the transition and what its competitive advantage is in doing so. If we really want to lead, that will require particular types of investment and attention to making sure that we do that. So I guess to kick off with the panel, so what does, and this we can start with Roger, what does leading the transition look like in Western Sydney? And casting your mind forward, what does good look like in 10 years or so when the real critical deadlines are starting to hit?
Thank you. I certainly believe it's a lot about the strategic alignment you're talking about and partnerships, which we have developing very well. I'll give a couple of examples. Our Western Growth Strategy is developing our vertical campuses on established transportation hubs. and very much aligned with GBCA's increasing the bar with our move towards low carbon buildings. And they're underpinned by more sophisticated development and commercial arrangements. Another mention, and I like the inner and outer rings, they tend to be in the inner ring. In the outer rings, our traditional campuses are right next to TAFEs. So alignment between vocational and tertiary, and also, for example, in Hawkesbury with STEM specialist high schools, provides the opportunity for educational precincts, which allows the lifelong learning that was mentioned earlier and those integrated pathways. Circular economy opportunity, we've been working very closely with Sydney Water with our water recycling schemes and stormwater in Hawkesbury, which is our best example of circular economy. And that provides a platform for a newly emerging Hawkesbury Circular Economy Hub with Hawkesbury City Council and Sydney Water and ourselves each playing our part in a commercial agri-tech hub. I think it's very much there about timing. For example, Hawkesbury City Council is moving to food organic, green organic, so the timing is right to connect those dots. The big picture one, climate action and resilience, we're just going through climate active accreditation, which provides us a new language and methodology for looking at what our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions are, and therefore a good new analytical basis for looking at what our carbon transitions might be. Similarly, our resilience planning, which we've just started, adapts the model used by Resilience Sydney. And there are a number of emerging new mechanisms which we want to boldly engage with. Biodiversity credits, carbon credits, carbon trading, being more agile and engaging in that space. Nutrient offsets, which is an EPA program, which I know Sydney Water is engaging with us in. So it's all about also not just aligning with what is here now, but also being agile to engage all the new emerging methodologies and technologies as they come forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Guy, I know you've got a bit of a different challenge and a view about what the future looks like from a distribution perspective. I
mean, if we take the competitive advantage part of the question, I think the big picture one for me, if you talk about Western Sydney in terms of the growth part, in terms of sort of parklands and sort of Aerotropolis, and then you build out from the airport. And I think we start to get immune to the sort of the numbers that get thrown around. So we're talking, the 40 billions, and it seems to move sort of daily. I can assure you that's a competitive advantage when people start throwing those numbers around. And then we've now sort of moved from the airport to Bradfield in terms of sort of language. But Bradfield, you're talking about 2 million people in the sort of mid-2050s. That's like 3 decades away. 2 million, I did a pitch in the UK, and so Bradfield means nothing to anyone when you're sort of pitching. And then you go, it's a field at the moment, and in 30 years' time, it's going to have 2 million people. That's twice the size of Amsterdam, from nothing in 30 years. So you've got a competitive advantage straight away when you just think about what's in that pipeline in quite a short period of time. Look, from a distribution, from an energy distribution perspective, one of the real advantage that I would say Australia's got and Western Sydney's got that is a bit more unique than some other locations. We talk a lot about transmission. We talk about sort of top-end renewables, so large-scale solar and wind farms replacing coal. I think the whole world has woken up to it at the same time, which is a bit of a concern. The whole world's woken up to the fact that you need to build transmission lines, which you do. Don't underestimate that. But what you've also got in Australia is by 2030, 50% of us in the room is going to have solar on our roofs. Quite a big proportion have probably made a conscious choice on a battery for storage. Quite a few of us will have an EV vehicle, which you could actually use to your advantage again. From a network perspective, from an individual perspective. I don't think we quite grasp the sustainability piece that's to our advantage if we really want to play it out, but we will. and it will happen very quickly in the next decade. So you've got a real advantage. And when I say 50% of New South Wales of sort of Endeavour's catchment's going to have solar, that's an average. So I can assure you, every new build that's going in, that's sort of the development type, is probably going to have solar on it straight away. So you're going to have 100% in certain suburbs very quickly. So how do you harness that? And though, for me, we still talk about customer. What we should be talking about is generator, because it was a customer in the true sense in the old days that you wanted power for 24 hours. For 12 hours, you actually want to give it back now. Maybe with a battery for 16 hours, you want to give it back. So you're a true generator now, and that's our sustainability advantage I think we can really play out.
Yeah. And I guess, Chris, you've got a similar situation to Guy in terms of the network. There's a huge area of greenfields growth,
Yep.
but you've got to manage an existing network as well. How, going forward and achieving a clean green future, do we manage the costs so that we contain, we manage the affordability issue, but we try and keep things under wraps so that it doesn't get out of control in terms of cost, managing the existing network and building the new?
Yeah, good question, Struan. And I'll just add to what Guy's been talking about, the competitive advantage and our competitive advantage in Western Sydney. It's not just that we want to do it, it's that we need to do it. And let me tell you why. It's because our customers are telling us that this is what we want. If I use the Western Sydney Airport, Simon's commitments to sustainability targets as an example, commitments to using recycled water during the construction, commitments to green energy, these are fundamental game changers for Western Sydney. If you look at the larger developers developing hundreds of hectares of land with individual precincts, all making commitments towards sustainable futures. If you look at some of the data centres in Western Sydney, there's upwards of 30 data centres that will be in existence in the not too distant future. These are massively power hungry, massively water hungry. And the large international organisations behind them, the AWSs, the Googles, the Microsofts, the AirTrunks, etc., they're all saying, this is what we want. We want green. Not just want, this is what we're purchasing. Green, sustainable energy and sustainable water as well. And so if you think about what our customers are telling us as well, and the community, one of the major things that our community is telling us is that they want a sustainable future. And so for us, we've got a goal off the back of that to be net zero by 2030. We're one of the top 10 energy users in the state, and we're about 30% the way there to that goal for our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we've clearly got some work to do. So getting to your question about how do we do it, well, it actually makes economic sense to do that by providing value for money for our customers. And one of the investments that we're making in Western Sydney, the Advanced Water Recycle Centre, is $1.5 billion worth of investment. And this thing's going to be net energy positive from day one. And that's just the start of it. Yeah. And so we're working with an investigation with our 8 local councils in partnership to see how can we create a regional green waste facility to really scale the energy outputs of all of the green waste from the local council collections and so forth, and to put that energy back into the grid as clean energy. This is going to be one of the largest green investments in New South Wales on foot. We signed the contracts about a month ago, and that's how we do it. I mean, the competitive advantage is simply that there is land, there is a significant amount of capital flowing into Western Sydney, but it's not just the competitive advantage, it's that we need to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, you've talked a bit about circular economy activities that you're doing, and you're all involved in it. Terri, really keen to hear your views in terms of what you're seeing outside in around Western Sydney and its competitive advantage and ability to drive a circular economy outcomes.
Yeah, I think, and I should say, it's just, as an outsider, it's so terrific to be back here at Western Sydney. It's just a wonderful region, and seeing some of the projects last night that were commended and awarded, and hearing the speakers this morning, it's just a really exciting place to be. There's so much buzz in the room, so thanks for having a Queenslander in your summit today. Circular economy is so important, and we know it's important. We've talked about the need for emissions reduction and for climate change action, A big challenge still, one of the world's leading circular economy organisations, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, says that energy efficiency and the energy transition only addresses 55% of emissions. If we want to address the other 45%, we've got to think about the way that products and services and business models work. And so circular economy is really important for reducing emissions and for addressing climate change. It's also really important for addressing the biodiversity crisis the world's in. You know, Australia, world leader in mammal extinctions, not a great leadership role to have, but the whole world is now facing up to biodiversity issues, and we've even got the kind of other COP, as I like to think of it, the COP on the Convention for Biological Diversity happening. And if you think about the fact that human activity is leading to biodiversity loss and the potential consequences that that can have for life on Earth, that's another really good reminder about why we have to really embrace circular economy, because if we can address human activity by designing out waste and pollution at every stage of a life cycle of a product or service, actually keeping products and materials in use for the longest possible time at their highest possible value, and regenerating nature, you can see why at each of those components of the circular economy framework we are addressing biodiversity loss. So it's so important. And what's the competitive advantage here? We've already heard about the fact that you've got these great greenfields areas, massive greenfields area in Western Parklands cities region, which is an incredible opportunity because it means that you can start from the beginning, from kind of square one, thinking about embedding circular economy into the things that you're doing. So that is an incredibly important competitive advantage. But I think the other thing that you have here that's really noticeable, again as an outsider, is the institutional capacity that you have in Western Sydney. You know, so many of your organisations are already working together, collaborating, and bearing in mind the importance of circular economy. So if you look at Simon's Airport, I think we probably just keep calling it Simon's Airport forever now, that might be its new name. They're already thinking through and embedding in the design and construction circular economy principles. If you look at Western Parklands Authority, they're already working on circular economy from the ground up. Sydney Water, of course, one of the nation's leading organisations when it comes to circular economy. And I've got to say, just a shout out to my organisation, Circular Australia's CEO, Lisa McLean, in her absence. Back when we were New South Wales Circular, she and the organisation Sydney Water worked really collaboratively on the quite, I think, famous report in relation to the circular economy opportunity in Western Sydney. And you can see from the work that the organisation that Sydney Water does in relation to whether it's recycled water, whether it's byproducts of wastewater and water, whatever the aspect of the business is, they've found ways to embed circularity and create value. And at the end of the day, you know, all of those things, the university, the energy transition, I think we've talked about so many of the organisations that are working really hard. Jacqueline's organisation, you know, the Lakes is going to be a great opportunity to embed and demonstrate circular economy principles. And so I think because you've got that institutional capacity, you've got the big infrastructure spends, you've got the greenfields areas, you have the capacity to be not just, you know, what I think you already are, a leader in Australia, but a real demonstration project for the whole world about how circular economy can be scaled up really rapidly in a region for the benefit of the people and for nature. So I think that's really a great starting point to speak from, and it's exciting to get to see it and to be part of it.
Yeah, great. And I think, you know, some really good points there, particularly in terms of sort of, I think, you know, moving beyond waste and into designing in these principles to the way you run your business, the way you develop your, you know, your own products and the inputs that you take. A how question. So how do we, in achieving this, how do we transform the way we plan and the regulatory environment and other considerations that sit around us in terms of the environment we're operating within to achieve this? Chris.
Oh, wow. We've had a number of speakers up here already talking about the complex planning environment. I think the point is that starting with the vision of the 3 cities, that was a game changer as a state-owned corporation for us to be able to start setting a future direction and policy targets off the back of something that was certain. And so for me, the 2 pieces on that front is around creating certainty and sticking to that certainty, and then simplifying how the approvals work for that. You mentioned also the regulatory space. Our regulators are changing the way that they operate. It's taking some time, but I still feel like there's a lot to go in that space. If I use the example of a piece of technology that we've been trying to introduce, it's an in-house recycled water unit. It's about the size of a fridge and can save about 35 to 45% of a household's water use. We've been working through the various forms of regulation, state, federal, for 3 years, and we're still not quite there.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of different hurdles. And if a private sector institution was to try and do that off their own back, there's absolutely no chance to be able to drive that investment required. So being able to simplify the regulatory framework and get our regulators to go even more so about how do we foster the change is something that we'd love to see.
Yeah.
I think be braver, plan longer. If was where I would be picking it up. I sit in a model where it's chunked down into 5 years. 5 years doesn't work in long-term planning anyway. And we're all a bit guilty of that. You can sort of look at the other side and blame somebody else, but we're all a bit guilty sitting in that. And as an industry, I know I sit in an industry that plays that within that five-year time frame. And so, I've sort of said, like, why don't you move to 2035 and work backwards rather than try to get to 2035? Because you'll probably get a reasonable assessment of where you're going to be. In our industry, you can give some pretty good stats of where a customer will be in 10 years' time, and it's in a very different place to where it is today. So you sort of got to be brave on that. And so, regulation, I can also sympathise with legislation and regulation because it's easy to point a finger, but any of us has been in an industry that moves very quickly. Like, you're not going to get this sort of legislator and a regulator at the same pace, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. What that probably means is you can't do it to scale. So why don't you prove that you can do it? Because by the time you can do it to scale, you'll probably get your regulator and your legislator over the line. There's an interesting question. I think the third slide, as you're sort of pinging down, is on community batteries. Now, technically, we would probably not really be allowed to put a community battery in because everyone's going to have a debate on you can't do generation, and we're going to go, it's not generation, it's storage. And you don't sort of get there because it doesn't sit in the current rules, but you can do it because we can do sort of 20, 30 of them, and we need them. And they're a really good social outcome for a community that I can assure you cannot afford to spend 10 grand putting it in their own house, and they certainly can't afford it when it's not even their house. So surely there's a better social outcome that actually works for us from a network perspective, because we'll actually see and have better visibility of the network and actually therefore make sure energy's in the right place at the right time at the right cost than having no visibility of lots of batteries behind somebody's house. So you sort of can do it, and I think by the time you do enough of them, legislation and regulation will catch up because it's clearly a good idea and it's the customer will drive it because they want it. So you'll get there. So yeah, look at yourself as well as the sort of legislator and the regulator, because I think we could push a bit more to make sure it happens.
Yeah. And so, Roger, in terms of other, you're obviously a significant, or the university is a significant landholder. Who do you look to globally as to who's doing the best work with the land they own and working with organisations to develop that in the right way with circular and other principles in play, but also to a net zero future as well?
I suppose we look a lot just to our local partners and people because it's the context within. We do look for international best practice, but the context of their institutional arrangements and things like that can be so different that my belief is we build from the inside out. And so it's a lot of the internal dynamics. We know that it's very non-linear in our own organisational development. We can have points where we get significant changes in commitment from, like our Vice-Chancellor is absolutely fabulous at that, within a context of a major change, say in federal government, which is suddenly a large enabler. I think just try to draw upon the best expertise we have around us and embed ourselves in our local, working with our local regulators who are also our advisors. Sydney Water is a good example of that, because we sit within their regulatory framework and they actually protect us from IPART, which is very nice. And so we look very much for what we can do internally based upon our own character, and then just trying to be agile when we can, because the dynamics change so much. An example of our own internal planning is moving away from, and my colleague here who's teaming our estate planning, moving away from master planning to placemaking, which is principles based and therefore more flexible given the uncertainties and the vagaries and what you're doing at what times, and trying to embed commercial operations and tenants within what we're doing, so they're drivers. For us as well, the big driver is the expectations of our students. They're our clientele. So we must be walking the talk, whether we're walking it step by step, or we're trialling it, or we're making a few minor, coming across challenges, or we're able to scale it up. We must be walking the talk, because that's the expectation from our changing client base.
Yep. Fantastic. I'll take a question from the audience here. So I think Guy and even possibly Chris, how do we improve the quality of housing built in Western Sydney to reduce reliance on air conditioning for new stock?
That makes me a builder, doesn't it? I don't. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think we've got used to it, and so I think we've got to drive that with the sort of building and the planning to actually make it happen. That there are solutions for it if you want to use it. And clearly, air conditioning, that's how houses were built. They tended to utilise sort of what they could to sort of get there. So I think we've got a conscious choice in that, in terms of what we decide that we want to purchase. On what we want to decide to live in as well. It's an interesting one, because unfortunately, obviously from an energy perspective, I sort of wasn't in the sector at the time, but it was a nightmare for the sector when it happened, because it wasn't predicted, the take-up that it would happen. So actually one of the challenges that it's now used for from an energy sector is we don't want electric vehicles to be air conditioning too. We actually want to make sure that we actually plan to understand what the take-up of electric vehicles is going to be, and how they're going to be charged and how they're going to be utilised. Because if we get that wrong, we're going to get that very wrong. Because again, that's going to be literally like, nearly every house has got air conditioning. In 15 years' time, nearly every house is going to have 1 or 2 electric vehicles possibly. So it's one that we're really conscious of to play with, and maybe we can learn some lessons that you don't all need it, and there are alternative solutions that we should think about. I'd suggest we looked at some of the old methods of building, if you really want to look at it, because they worked for a long time, and maybe relook at something. You might not need to have to reinvent, you might just need to see what was built 100 years ago that utilised it.
I'll keep it short. It turns out when you have sufficient canopy cover and you add water to those trees, you can cool the ambient temperature by about 6.8 degrees. So a different perspective on how do you cool the environment.
Great, thank you. So we've got a minute left. Just wanted to run through the panel in terms of, if there was one thing that we could do to move faster, or a barrier that needs to be unblocked to better achieve a clean and green future, what would it be? Who'd like to go? Roger.
For ourselves, it's enabling our students to take handle of it and create their own futures. They're the guardians and the stewards of their own futures.
For us, it's obviously increasing the take-up of circular economy in places and in sectors where it hasn't necessarily been done as much before. Australia, the great thing about not having a particularly advanced take-up of circular economy yet here in Australia compared with Europe and the UK is that it means that there's so much upside, there's so much opportunity there. And so whether you're thinking built environment, infrastructure construction, whether you're thinking, we've talked about in our organisation finding new opportunities in supply chains to build alliances so that people might have heard about our work with St Vincent's, to connect them with a wind farm manufacturer and reduce clinical waste that way. Whatever it is, it's all about design thinking to design out waste and pollution, to think about, as I said, products and services, but also business models that help keep things in use at their highest value use, and really thinking about how can we actually make a positive contribution to regenerating nature. And there are opportunities in almost every area of human activity to take a circular economy approach.
Great. Guy?
I've sort of, recently been saying, I said, just be a bit braver. Stop looking for the perfect solution. 80% is a really good solution, so why don't you go for it? And I reckon you actually might move a bit quicker then. And I think we're all guilty of being a bit perfectionists. And that's also why we like rules and regulations as well. So push it a bit harder and accept that 80% would have got you a pretty good qualification if you passed on that rate.
Yep. And Chris?
Just follow on from Guy, actually, that I think we've got these two scales, one of city scale things that are going to be certain, and we need the certainty behind those mega transport infrastructure projects. At the same time, if we're going to innovate, we have to try and do things differently, so we need to be brave. We know that not everything's going to work, so to take a risk behind it, and one of the things that both Endeavour and Sydney Water are doing at the moment is a pop-up swimming pool at Prospect. We're not a swimming pool organisation, neither is Endeavour, but it's what our customers are telling us that they want: green, renewable energy providing for a pop-up swimming pool, free pop-up swimming pool in Western Sydney. So we're giving it a try, and so far it's going so good.
And you got to Australia to go to it, haven't you? That was a free plug, wasn't it?
All right. It's lunchtime, everybody. I've held you up long enough, so thank you very much. Please thank the panel.
Thanks.